In part one of this presentation, we saw how the 10 northern tribes, called the house of Ephraim or the house of Israel, went into the Assyrian dispersion or the diaspora. In this section, we're going to ratchet it up a bit. We're going to talk about how the southern 2 tribes of Judah went into what's called the Babylonian exile. We're also going to talk about why the southern kingdom of Judah went into the Babylonian exile. Now, Ephraim committed the exact same sins, but just bearing that in mind, how the 2 things play together as one. Just remember, the diaspora is the house of Ephraim, or the 10 northern tribes, and the exile is Judah and the southern 2 tribes. In order to understand why the southern house of Judah went into the exile, we have to understand what's called hearing Yahweh's voice. Now, there's a big misconception out there in the Messianic world. So, I went to one assembly recently, and the people there were telling me that hearing Yahweh's voice is the same thing as when we read from his Torah. So they were saying reading the commandments in Scripture is the exact same thing as hearing and obeying his voice. Okay, we're going to see that's wrong. So we're going to see that's wrong from the Torah. There's 2 separate things that we need to understand. One is hearing Yahweh's voice, and the other one is keeping the commandments that are written in the Torah. We're going to see that from Scripture. So in 1 Kings chapter 19, starting in verse 11, so Yahweh is speaking to Eliyahu or Elijah, and then Yahweh said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before Yahweh. And behold, Yahweh passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before Yahweh. But Yahweh was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But Yahweh was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But Yahweh was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice." We talk about this more in the video Spirit and Truth, hearing the still small voice. But it's very important that we understand what it is to hear Yahweh's still small voice. Because if we don't understand what it is to hear and obey Yahweh's voice, we can't understand why Ephraim and Judah went into captivity. And furthermore, we'll commit exactly the same sins as they did. And we need to not commit those sins if we want to be brought back home to the land of Israel. In verse 13, 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 13. "So it was when Eliyahu heard this still small spiritual voice." May have been audible, but probably was a still small spiritual voice. "And so it was when Eliyahu heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle, and he went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And suddenly a voice came to him. He said, 'What are you doing here, Eliyahu?'" A lot of people have a hard time with the concept that we should be listening for a still small spiritual voice. They say, "Willis, you should be on medications. You're hearing voices and this sorts of things." Okay, let's take a look at Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 21. It says, "Your ears," this is a prophecy, so we know this is coming to pass. And it says, "Your ears shall hear a word behind you, saying, 'This is the way, walk in it, whenever you turn to the right hand, or whenever you turn to the left.'" Now, this may seem like craziness to a lot of you, but some of us have had these sorts of experiences where you just get an urging, you get a feeling in your gut like you need to do something, or you need to say something, or you should hold off. Maybe you were going to talk to someone, and you just get this feeling in your stomach like, not right now. Or maybe I better not walk down this road. Or just something, a little birdie tells you, so to speak, a little birdie tells you, maybe I better do this over here, or maybe I better not say that. And if you obey that still small spiritual voice, if you obey that word that you hear in your ears behind you, things turn out well for you. But if you don't obey that voice, things don't turn out so well. So we talk about this more in the video, Spirit and Truth, Hearing Yahweh's Voice. Let's see these commandments in the Torah, and let's see why it's the difference of hearing Yahweh's voice and reading his commandments. In Deuteronomy chapter 13 and verse 4, it says, "You shall walk after Yahweh your Elohim, and fear him, and keep his commandments," meaning the written Torah, and obey his voice. Two separate things. Keep his commandments and obey his voice. You shall serve him and hold fast to him. Exodus 19 and verse 5 says, Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, meaning the written Torah, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. In Deuteronomy 26 and verse 17 says, Today you have proclaimed Yahweh to be your Elohim, and that you will walk in his ways and keep his statutes, his commandments and his judgments, referring to his written Torah, and that you will obey his voice. So we see there's two separate things here. There's the written Torah, and there's hearing and obeying his still small voice. Now Satan wants us to believe that we don't need to hear his still small voice. We just saw the commandments written right there in Scripture that we need to do this. Satan wants us to believe, he wants to teach us that we don't need to do this. Satan wants us to believe that we can just do whatever seems right in our own eyes. And a lot of people don't understand the difference between hearing and obeying Yahweh's voice and doing whatever seems good and right in our own eyes. Instead of hearing a word behind us saying, this is the way, walk in it, people get willful and they follow the desires of their own heart. So we need to understand the differences here. In Genesis chapter 3, starting in verse 4, Then the serpent said to the woman, Hava or Eve, You will not surely die if you disobey. For Elohim knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like Elohim, knowing the difference between good and evil, so that you can make up your own mind what you want to do. Satan's saying, you don't need to hear and obey Yahweh's voice. Satan's saying, you'll be like Elohim. You don't need to hear his voice. You can listen to your own thoughts. You can make up your own mind what you want to do, and it's not a problem. But Yahweh disagrees. In Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 8, Yahweh says, You shall not at all doing as we're doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. And this is basically the definition of the Messianic movement today. Operational definition is everyone doing whatever is good and right in his own eyes, instead of hearing and obeying Yahweh's voice. So we're going to build on this understanding now. So the thing we need to see is that there's four main offices in Israel. One is the kingship, which is government, which basically is force. It's the army, it's the military. Then you have the priesthood. And one thing we're going to see, we need to understand is there's more than one priesthood contained in the written Torah. Now there's a Levitical priesthood and a Melchizedekian priesthood. The priesthood, whichever one we're under, covers the legal aspects and also the rituals, the rites and rituals. The third main office is that of the prophet. Now, a prophet hears in the Spirit. A prophet hears a voice behind him. This is something we're all supposed to do, but the prophet has a special gifting and a special calling upon his life. We'll talk about that in more detail in his later slide set. But the prophet's main job is to hear Yahweh's voice and to speak and act according to it. And then we're going to see the anointed judge, which is a special combination of all three. Anytime there's not a king, quite often there's an anointed judge, or special combination. So the Ephraimites, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, which became the lost 10 tribes, because they weren't hearing Yahweh's voice and they weren't keeping his commandments. Well, the southern kingdom of Judah did a better job of keeping the written commandments, but they still weren't hearing and obeying Yahweh's voice. So if you're not hearing his voice, you're not keeping his written commandments, because his written commandments tell us to obey his voice. So just like Yahweh sent prophets to the northern kingdom, Yahweh also sent prophets to the southern kingdom to get them to turn back and hear and obey his voice. Jeremiah chapter 7, starting in verse 23. Yahweh says, But this is what I commanded them, saying, Obey my voice, and then I'll be your Elohim, and you shall be my people, and walk in all the ways that I have commanded you, that it may be well with you. He wants it to be well with us. He says, yet they did not obey, nor incline their ear, but followed the counsels and the dictates of their evil hearts, just like Satan wants us to do. Satan doesn't want us listening to his voice or inclining our ear. Satan wants us to follow the counsels and the dictates of our own hearts. He says, and they went backward and not forward. Jeremiah 29 verse 10, he says, for thus says Yahweh, after 70 years are completed at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you and cause you to return to this place. Just as the Ephraimites didn't listen, and they went in, the 10 tribes went into the Assyrian diaspora, the 2 southern tribes didn't listen either. So Judah went into Babylon for 70 years, and of course, without a temple, there was no support, no place for the people to bring their tithes and offerings, so the Levitical priesthood collapsed. Without a Levitical priesthood, the people were without spiritual leadership. Without spiritual leadership, the people began to lose their spiritual identity. So people began to start to assimilate. Well, the Levites, seeing this, realized they had to do something new. They had to do something different. So to hold the people together, to hold the people of Judah together, they had to redefine what the Torah is. Now, we in the Ephraimite movement, we understand that Yahweh gave his Torah to Moshe, and we are not to add anything to or take anything away from Yahweh's Torah. We are supposed to do what Yahweh says, hear his voice, and keep his written commandments. The rabbis define this as something else. The rabbis claim that Yahweh gave Moshe the authority to dictate the Torah. And the rabbis say, this is what, so we call the Torah of Moshe, the rabbis call Torah law. And they believe that the rabbis, or the great ones, the great men of each generation, can dictate Torah law in response to the needs of the time. It's more in terms of a Supreme Court kind of a thing. We tend to see Moshe as a prophet, and then the rabbis tend to see Moshe as more of a dictator or an autocrat. So the Torah of Moshe is what Yahweh said, and includes hearing and obeying Yahweh's voice. Torah law becomes whatever the rabbis say, so whatever the rabbis dictate for us to do. If you look in the rabbinical literature, in the Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Eruvin, 21 in verse B, it says, my son, be more careful in the observance of the words of the scribes than in the words of the Torah. Understand what they're saying. They're saying pay more attention to the words of the rabbis than the words of Yahweh. For in the laws of the Torah there are positive and negative precepts. But as to the laws of the scribes, whoever transgresses any of the enactments of the scribes, well, he incurs the penalty of death. To the rabbis, everything is a court. So if we remember, when someone had leprosy, they would come up to the temple, and then the priests and the Levites would take a look at him, and they'd examine this kind of a thing, and they'd pronounce him, either he's clean or he's still unclean. Either he's cleansed or he's still a leper. So all these legal pronouncements. Well, of course, this is why the rabbinical order is an outgrowth of the Levitical order. So, of course, they're still legally oriented. So everything is a court. They even assume that Elijah, or Eliyahu the prophet, also had a court. They're reading in. So again, we're reading the rabbinical literature, the Babylonian Tractate Talmud Avodah Zarah, section 36 and A. And they say, pardon my tone, they say, a court is unable to annul the decisions of another court. Everything is a court to them. A court is unable to annul the decisions of another court unless it is superior to it in wisdom and numerical strength. So it has to do with majority rulings. It has to do with voting, essentially. Furthermore, Rabbah bar Hana said in the name of Rabbi Yohanan, in all matters, a court can annul the decisions of another court except the 18 things, which are prohibited by both the schools of Hillel and Shammai. For even were Elijah and his court, his alleged court, to come and declare those 18 things permitted, we must not listen to him. So notice the difference in tone between Yahweh's words and the words of the rabbis. So Yahweh says, this is what I'm giving you to do. You shall not add to it, nor shall you take anything away from it. And what the rabbis are saying is, here's our majority ruling. You can annul it if you have a bigger court, except for these 18 things which we all agree. And even then, if Yahweh sends a prophet, even a prophet as great as Eliyahu, to tell you that this is ridiculous, we must not listen to him. So understand the difference in spirits between what's going on with Yahweh's word and Yahweh's Torah and the rabbinical Torah law. Can we see the difference in that spirit? One is listen to Yahweh and obey Yahweh, and one is we're not even going to listen to Yahweh's prophet if he contradicts our majority ruling. Is that a different spirit? So the translation is, don't listen to Yahweh's prophets, listen to us. Well, in Sifrei Deuteronomy 154 and verse 11, the rabbis tell us, even if they tell you that right is left or left is right, you must listen to them. Well, where have we heard this before? In Genesis chapter 3, and I say this in love, I say this in all respect, but I say this in truth. In Genesis chapter 3, starting in verse 4, the serpent said to the woman, you won't surely die by transgressing Yahweh's Torah, for Elohim knows that in the day you eat of the tree of the knowledge, in the day that you start thinking for yourself, you'll be like Elohim. You'll be able to discern the difference between good and evil. So Yahweh always gives us his commandment and puts a period. Satan always tries to put a question where Yahweh puts a period. So this is the difference. Well, Paul, or Shaul, in Romans chapter 10, starting in verse 1, he says, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to Elohim for Israel is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for Elohim, but not according to knowledge. For they being ignorant of Elohim's righteousness, for they being ignorant of the way Yahweh does things, and seeking to establish their own righteousness, or seeking to establish their own way of becoming justified, they have not submitted to the righteousness of Elohim. And this is exactly what we've seen. Yahweh gives us his Torah and tells us not to add or take away. The rabbis make their own majority rulings, and they tell us even if Yahweh sends a prophet, we're not going to listen to him. So remembering that the Levites had a legal orientation, and that the rabbinical order is an outgrowth of the Levitical order, they feel it's okay to make up their own laws now because they're redefining the Torah for their generation. They're not receiving Yahweh's Torah and holding fast to that. They believe they've been given the authority to set Torah, and so they're issuing their own rulings. So in Exodus chapter 30, in verse 17, Yahweh spoke to Moshe, and he tells the priesthood to make a laver of bronze so they can wash their hands and their feet, so good hygiene and that they not die before Yahweh. It says, you shall also make a laver of bronze, with its base also of bronze, for washing, so they can wash their hands and their feet. And you shall put it between the tabernacle of meeting and the altar, and you shall put water in it. Well, obviously, the purpose here is good hygiene and also ritual cleanliness, to keep ritually clean before Yahweh. Well, the priesthood, the rabbinical order, if you've ever been to an Orthodox Jewish home, they may have just washed their hands. They came in from outside, washed their hands. But now even so, they just washed their hands. They're going to have dinner or whatever they do. They may pass a small wash basin, and along they're going to pass a special two-handled cup. So this is an extract from the it's an offshoot, a derivation from the original commandment of the brazen laver. So they're going to ritually wash their hands with this special two-handled cup then saying a special prayer, and they believe if they don't follow this man-made ritual, what they call takanot and ma'asim, they believe if they don't follow the rabbinic tradition, the rabbinic ruling, then the meal is no good and they're not sanctified before Yahweh. So once again, they, not having received Elohim's righteousness, but attempting to establish their own righteousness, their own rulings, their own Torah law, they believe that this makes them pleasing before Yahweh, their Elohim. Well, Yeshua had some things to say about this kind of attitude, this kind of a spirit, the rabbinical spirit. It applies to the Messianics as well. So in Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 1, the scribes and the Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Yeshua saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? Why don't you do the things that the elders and the Pharisees tell us to do? For they don't wash their hands and feet when they eat bread." So the rabbis had their own way of doing things. And Yeshua answered and said to them, "Why do you transgress the commandment of Elohim because of your tradition?" And he gives examples. He says, "For Elohim commanded, in Yahweh's Torah, Elohim commanded, saying, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and 'He who curses father or mother, let him be put to death.' But you say," in contradiction, "but you say, whoever says to his father or mother, Ma, Pa, whatever profit I might have given you, whatever profit you might have received from me, that's a gift to Elohim. Then he need not honor his father or mother." Yeshua says, "Thus you have made the commandment of Elohim of no effect by your tradition." You're making up your own rulings. He said, "Hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, 'These people draw near to me with their mouth, and they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. For in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" They're not teaching to keep the commandments of Yahweh, they're teaching to keep the commandments of men. Let's take another example. In Shulchan Aruch, or Achaim 2 and verse 4, the rabbis tell us a person must first put on his right shoe, but not tie it. Then he must put on his left shoe and tie it, and then he goes back and ties his right shoe. And the very interesting thing about the rabbinical rulings and teachings is, because they treat it like a supreme court, once rulings have been in effect for 3 or 4 generations, now they are considered to carry the weight of law. And as we saw earlier, whoever transgresses the rulings of the scribes, the enactments of the scribes, incurs the penalty of death. So it's not so much that it's critically important that you that you put on your right shoe or this or that. What they're really saying here is, whoever does not obey the rabbis, whoever does not submit to rabbinical Torah law, whoever does not submit to the rabbinical authority, incurs the penalty of death. If you're still keeping Yahweh's Torah, if you're keeping Yahweh's Torah, and you're not adding to or taking away, and you're ignoring the rabbinical Torah law, you incur the penalty of death. That's what they're really saying. Now, in order to understand Yeshua's next words, let's take a look. In Chorazin, Israel, this is an example of what used to be called the seat of Moses. We can read about it in the Renewed Covenant. In Matthew chapter 23, starting in verse 1, "Then Yeshua spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, 'The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moshe's seat,'" where the Torah is read. And what they used to do is they would put the Torah scroll in front of Moshe's seat. And when the scribes and the Pharisees would sit in Moshe's seat, where the Torah is read from, they would preach the words of Moshe. They'd preach Yahweh's words through Moshe, instead of preaching their own things. So Yeshua says the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moshe's seat where the Torah is read. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, because they're reading Yahweh's words through Moshe. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. Yeshua says, but you do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Messiah, and you are all brethren. But how many people do we have who are called Rabbi in the Messianic world? Verse 9, he says, do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. But that's what the Pope is called, is the Holy Father. And the other Catholic priests, they're called Father. Verse 10, he says, and do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Messiah. Well, how many people in the Messianic world do we have who are called teachers? Verse 11, he says, but he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself, he'll be exalted. And he says, this is important, he says, but woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. And what Yeshua is talking about is, to enter the kingdom of heaven, we need to hear Yahweh's voice and keep the commandments that Yahweh himself gave through his servant Moshe. And now what we have over here in the rabbinic world is the rabbinic world says, you ignore Yahweh's commandments because we were the ones who were given the authority to establish Torah. And if you disobey the enactments of the scribes, you incur the penalty of death. So what the rabbis are really teaching people is not to turn to Yahweh as their Elohim, but to turn to them as their Elohim. So they are essentially exalting and establishing themselves as Elohim. That's essentially what they're trying to do. In the Babylonian Talmud, in Baba Metzia 59 in B, said Rabbi Jeremiah, because the Torah had already been given at Mount Sinai, in other words, because Yahweh gave the authority to set Torah to us at Mount Sinai. So Yahweh gave us the authority to establish Torah law. Said Rabbi Jeremiah, because Yahweh gave us the authority to establish Torah at Mount Sinai, we pay no attention to a heavenly voice. Are we getting this? Because you have, in other words, because Yahweh gave us the authority to establish Torah, we no longer even attempt to hear Yahweh's voice. Because you have long since written in the Torah at Mount Sinai, after the majority must one incline. Well, the Torah doesn't say that anywhere. In fact, what the Torah says is, you shall not follow after a crowd to do evil. So what Yahweh's commandment is, hear my voice, obey my voice, and keep my written commandments. And what the rabbis say is, we don't pay attention to a heavenly voice because you told us that whatever our majority ruling is, we're cool. But Yahweh never said that. So again, Yahweh's saying, obey my voice, keep my commandments, and listen to my prophets. And what the rabbis are saying is, obey our voices, keep our Torah law, and ignore Yahweh's prophets. Well, in Luke chapter 4 and verse 18, Yeshua tells us what his mission statement is. Yeshua tells us what he was sent to do. He gives us the battle plan, so the mission statement, so to speak. Luke chapter 4 and verse 18. He says, "The Spirit of Yahweh is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the spiritual captives of Ephraim and Judah, recovery of sight to those who are spiritually and physically blind, and to set at liberty those who are spiritually oppressed." Now, who are those in spiritual captivity? And who are those who are spiritually oppressed? So we have 10 northern tribes who've been taken into captivity. We also have the 2 tribes of Judah who are in spiritual captivity because 90% of the Jews never came back from Babylon. The 10% of the Jews that did come back from Babylon are now spiritually oppressed by the rabbis. And these are those that Yeshua came to set free. Otherwise, the alternative is that we believe Yeshua came to open all the prison doors, like he came to open the gates of Alcatraz. He came to open the gates of San Quentin. It makes no spiritual sense. What Yeshua came to do was to begin a long generational process of fulfilling the promises that were given to the patriarchs, that their children, their seed, would go into every nation, every family, and every clan, because the promise of salvation only ever pertained to Israel. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's genetics went into all the 4 corners of the earth, and then the faith in Yeshua would go forth. And this is how the people would begin to be called out, and they would get ready to return back home to their inheritance in Israel. And those who are lost, who are oppressed in rabbinic Judaism, those are those he came to set free from spiritual oppression. You know, we need to understand who our Messiah is. If we seek to be his bride, can you imagine a more ridiculous scenario that we seek someone to choose us as his bride, but we don't even want to know who he is or what he's sent to do in life? We don't know a thing about him. We don't know really what his job is or what he's trying to do. Well, how can we know how to please him if we don't know what his job is or what he's been sent to do or even what he wants? It doesn't make any sense. So let's take a look in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 25. It'll tell us who Messiah is. We already just saw in Luke 4:18 what he wants, what he was sent to do. It says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times." In the written study, we go through this. The command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem was given by King Artaxerxes, I believe, in 457 BCE, and we add the 483 weeks to that, and it comes out to 26 CE, which is when many scholars believe Yeshua began his ministry. But let's take a look at this word Messiah the Prince, because it's going to be very important in teaching us who our husband is. We look at the word prince. The word in Hebrew is Strong's Old Testament 5057, which is nagid. So the term gid is to tell. You're going to tell something. So a nagid is the one who is telling people what to do. There's a commander as occupying the front. So who Yeshua is Yeshua is a nagid. Yeshua is a commander who occupies the front. In other words, Yeshua is leading the spiritual battle from the front lines. That's what he came to do. So this is very important, and this helps to explain why the Pharisees rejected Yeshua. So here we have the Pharisees who believe they're in charge. They believe they've been given the authority to dictate and establish Torah law in Yahweh's name, much like the Pope does. So the Pharisees were looking for a military leader who would throw the Romans out of the land. And instead what Yeshua did is he launched a spiritual campaign against them. So in Matthew chapter 10, starting in verse 34, Yeshua says, "Don't think that I came to bring peace on earth. I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword or division." He says, "For I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household." He says, "He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." So if we recall back, Abraham had to leave his home and his father's house and be willing to sojourn in a land that Yahweh would show them. Then Abraham had to be willing to offer up and sacrifice his son Isaac at Yahweh's word. So Abraham did not love father and mother more than Yahweh. Abraham loved Yahweh more than father and mother, so he left his home and his father's house. And Abraham did not love his son or daughter more than he loved Yahweh. He loved Yahweh more. So Abraham was willing to offer up his own son, Isaac, on the altar. So Abraham loved Yahweh more than his own flesh and blood. Abraham loved Yahweh more than his own family. So what Yeshua has come to do is he's come to put us to the test. He's saying, what do you love? You love your family more than me? You love fellowship more than me? You love hanging out with the people you know more than me? You like familiar spirits? I mean, what's important to you? Where's your heart? Because where your heart is, there your treasure shall be also. So is your treasure here on earth? Is your treasure with your earthly family? Is your treasure with your children? Or is your treasure with me? I'm going to put you to the test because I need to know if I'm going to give you spiritual life, if I'm going to choose you to be my bride, I want to know that your heart is with me. So I'm going to ask you to put everything on the line and show me, prove to me that you love me more than you love your own flesh and blood. In verse 38 he says, "And he who does not take his cross or his stake or his tree or gallows or whatever you want to call it, he who does not take his cross or his stake and follow after me is not worthy of me." If you love your own life more than me, forget about it. He says, "He who finds his life will lose it, but he who loses his life for my sake will find it." So what is the world always telling us to do? The world is always telling us, get a life. Live your life. Enjoy your life. Spend your time enjoying your life. After all, Yahweh gave it to you. He wants you to live it, right? He wants you to enjoy yourself. He wants you to have a good time living your life. L'chaim! Yeshua says, he who finds his life will lose it. But he who lays down, he who loses his life for my sake, will find it for eternal life. So the rabbinical, which is an extension of the Levitical order, rejected Yeshua. So the rabbinical order became defiled. Because they're not hearing Yahweh's voice. They went backward and not forward. They, not accepting the righteousness of Elohim, they attempted to establish their own righteousness. Because they're not willing to hear and obey Yahweh's voice. La 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 la. They don't want to hear a still small voice behind them saying, this is the way, walk in it, whenever they turn to the right hand or whenever they turn to the left. So what was Yeshua going to do? The rabbinical order was defiled, and even if it had been time to reestablish the Levitical order, the Levitical lineages have been lost. So what's he going to do? As we're going to see in the next part, we're going to see what Yeshua came to do was to establish a new priesthood, not based on the Levitical Torah, not based on the rabbinical order, but Yeshua came to establish a new priesthood, or to reestablish an old priesthood based on the order of Melchizedek, that would not serve in a Levitical temple, would not offer animal sacrifices in a temple. Not that it had anything against that, But they would reorder and reestablish so they could go into all the four corners of the earth to bring back the lost children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in accordance with the prophecies given to the patriarchs. This would be a spirit-filled, Yahweh's voice-obeying priesthood with an entirely new and different Torah, which we'll discuss in the next section.